Hey guys, tonight we wander down narrow Victorian streets, where the gaslight flickers in sickly yellow halos and the cobblestones glisten with last night's drizzle. You can almost hear your own footsteps echo, sharp and hollow, as though London itself is wide awake with you. And that's the cruel joke, isn't it? You, a weary figure in a stiff wool coat, your brain buzzing with unfinished thoughts, staring at a sky forever dim with soot. You crave sleep, yet here you are, caught in a restless century that invented new ways to stay awake. And let's be honest, if you'd been born back then, you probably wouldn't survive half of the cures they offered. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is over there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The glow of gaslight shifts around you as you drift further into the century's sleepless nights. London's lamps stretch in neat rows, like nervous candles, their flames trapped in glass globes. Gaslight was supposed to be a marvel, a victory of progress, but for you it only means longer hours awake. Before this, darkness used to push people toward bed. Now shop windows stay lit, taverns hum with music, and even factories belch smoke at midnight. No wonder your eyelids refuse to close. How could they, with the world glowing defiantly against the natural rhythm? Doctors write in journals that this glow unsettles the body's inner clock, though they don't yet have the word circadian. They mutter instead about disordered nerves and artificial agitation. You feel it in your bones, the strange wakefulness that comes when night refuses to be night. Historians still argue whether gaslight genuinely disturbed sleep patterns on a mass scale, or whether it simply offered more hours for people to notice how restless they already were. Either way, you walk on, knowing you are not alone in this vigil. Your boots click past curtained windows where families whisper of insomnia like a curse. In parlors, the middle classes trade stories of husbands unable to rest after long days at the counting house, wives fretting over sickly children, daughters pacing with novels still open in their laps. One mainstream medical fact emerges again and again in advice columns. Insomnia, they warn, is not just a nuisance. It is a threat to your sanity. Doctors caution that prolonged sleeplessness could unravel the mind, leading to breakdown, delusion, or worse. The night, then, becomes both enemy and accuser, pressing its cold hand against your temple. And yet, you find laughter tucked into the shadows too. Did you know some Victorians swore that eating raw onions at bedtime could lull you to sleep? Imagine lying there, your breath sharp enough to ward off burglars, waiting for slumber that might never come. Quirky cures like this flit through newspapers alongside somber essays, reminding you how thin the line is between serious science and desperate superstition. You pause beneath a lamppost, letting the hiss of the flame fill your ears. Gaslight itself was not quiet. It spat and sizzled, leaked and sometimes even exploded. The very thing designed to illuminate safety often hummed like an insect swarm, a soundtrack that might keep you awake more than it helped you see. You picture yourself lying in bed, window cracked for air, and that restless hiss drifting in, needling at your thoughts until dawn. So you trudge on, past the Thames where black water reflects the quivering yellow glow. The smell of coal gas hangs in the air, heavy metallic, with a sweetness that clings to your throat. Some people insist that inhaling too much gas at night dulls the senses, makes the body restless instead of soothed. Others dismiss this as superstition. Again, historians still argue whether these theories were the seeds of modern environmental health, or just another Victorian worry, tucked between ghost stories and sermons. The city never quite sleeps. Night watchmen stamp their feet for warmth, rattling keys to prove their vigilance. Night soil men slosh their carts through the alleys, emptying privies with the kind of work no one wants to imagine. Market porters already stir, preparing for dawn's rush. The noise seeps in through shutters and chimney flues, reminding you that even if you wanted to rest, the city is conspiring against you. And yet, you realize, not everyone suffers equally. The wealthy insomniac can recline in a featherbed, tossing among silk sheets, with a physician on call and laudanum in the cabinet. The poor laborer curls on a straw mattress, too exhausted to notice the glow, slipping into heavy, dreamless sleep before his head touches the sack. For him, insomnia is a luxury he cannot afford. For you, caught in between, it becomes a badge of refinement, a problem that suggests your life is too civilized, too thoughtful, too overstimulated. As you stand at the crossroads of midnight, a final thought drifts in. Victorians are obsessed with cataloging their ailments, with scribbling them into diaries, reporting them in letters, even reading about them in serialized magazines. Sleep, or the lack of it, becomes a kind of social performance. If you confess at breakfast that you tossed and turned, your companions nod with knowing sympathy. If you claim instead to have slept like a log, someone may raise an eyebrow, as if to say you lack the nervous sensitivity that marks a truly modern mind. So here you are, the gaslight in your eyes, the restless hum in your ears, the first chapter of a long night stretching ahead. Already, you sense that what keeps you awake is not just the glow, but the knowledge that in Victorian England, sleeplessness itself has become an identity, a diagnosis, and maybe even a fashionable affliction. You leave the gaslit streets behind and drift into the drawing room, where a physician with an impressive beard is waiting to tell you the problem isn't the lamps, nor the clatter outside your window. It's you. Specifically, it's your brain. Doctors in the mid-19th century begin whispering about cerebral excitement, claiming that sleeplessness comes not from the body, but from minds running too hot. And you're the perfect victim, scribbling letters by candlelight, reading the Times until your eyes blur, trying to memorize Latin poetry long after dinner. It's not your weak stomach or your drafty bedroom. It's that overworked brain, swollen with ideas it refuses to release. You imagine the physician tapping your temple with his finger, warning. This organ has been overstimulated. He doesn't say anxiety or stress. Those belong to later centuries, but the meaning is clear enough. Too much thought, too much worry, too many racing calculations about bills, ships, sermons, and romance. Your skull has become a furnace, and every sleepless night is proof that the fire isn't dying down. One mainstream fact repeated endlessly in medical lectures is that sleeplessness must be treated early, before it evolves into madness. They believed insomnia could easily slide into melancholia, and from melancholia into full-blown insanity. So if you toss and turn for more than a few nights, your family might call in a doctor not just to help you sleep, but to keep you sane. Imagine that kind of pressure. Close your eyes or risk the asylum. No wonder your heart beats faster every time you fail to drift off. And the treatments reflect that fear. Some physicians instruct patients to stop reading newspapers after dinner. Too many columns to process. Others forbid music in the evenings. Too stimulating for the delicate mind. Still others ban late-night conversation altogether. You picture yourself in a parlor, sitting stiffly with your hands folded, not daring to tell your cousin about the funny thing you saw on the street, in case laughter overheats your brain and ruins your night. But here's the quirky part. Not every doctor blames thinking too much. Some insist the opposite, that insomnia proves you aren't thinking enough. The idle brain breeds restlessness, one pamphlet argues, urging the sleepless to try mathematics or memorization until fatigue sets in. Can you picture it? Lying in bed, reciting multiplication tables or the Kings of England backwards, waiting for slumber to sneak up. The cure is either less brain work or more brain work. Either way, your mind remains the battleground. Historians still argue whether Victorian physicians truly believed in a direct link between sleeplessness and insanity, or whether the rhetoric was exaggerated to frighten patients into compliance. Some claim it was a moralizing tactic. If you can't sleep, it's because you've lived improperly. Others believe the connection was sincere, rooted in real cases of breakdowns following long stretches of wakefulness. You, lying awake, don't have the luxury to debate. All you know is that dawn creeps closer, and your thoughts are still marching in circles. In this age, Nerves are the fashionable explanation for everything. Nervous disorders become the umbrella under which headaches, indigestion, fainting fits, and insomnia all gather. Doctors sketch elaborate diagrams of the nervous system, lines and threads crisscrossing like railway maps, and warn that overstimulation in one branch can rattle the entire structure. They recommend tonics, cool baths, and strict daily routines. But secretly, people begin to suspect that sleeplessness is simply the price of modernity. After all, who can relax when the world is accelerating around them? Railways, telegraphs, factories, novels, debates, science? You may long for rest, but your century refuses to pause. As the physician drones, you glance around his consulting room. Bottles of powders gleam on the shelves. A leather chair waits for the next trembling patient. A brass clock ticks loudly, reminding you of each second you remain awake. He hands you a pamphlet printed in tight Gothic script on the perils of overheated brains. The advice ranges from the obvious, avoid stimulants after supper, to the absurd, rub cold cabbage leaves on the forehead before bed. You suppress a smile, but part of you wonders if you should actually try it. After all, onions were supposed to work, weren't they? Later that night, back in your chamber, you lie down determined to follow the doctor's orders. No reading, no music, no chatter. Just the ticking of your own thoughts. And of course, it doesn't work. If anything, the silence grows unbearable, and you find yourself worrying about the very fact that you are worrying. That's the cruel cycle. You can't sleep because you're thinking too much, and now you're thinking too much about not being able to sleep. Welcome to the Victorian brain, overheating under its own weight. By the time the sky outside your curtains begins to pale, you wonder whether sleep is even the goal anymore, or whether sleeplessness itself has become your identity. You remember overhearing in the doctor's waiting room that some patients quietly enjoyed confessing their insomnia, the way others brag about working late or enduring hardship. To suffer from an overheated brain is to prove you're part of the intellectual, sensitive, modern elite. Maybe you're not sick after all. Maybe you're just fashionable. Still, fashionable or not, you would give anything for one night of dreamless rest. The doctor's stern warnings still echo in your ears as you step into a Victorian apothecary, its polished counter gleaming beneath a halo of lamplight. The air smells of chalk dust, peppermint, and something faintly metallic. Rows of glass bottles and tins line the shelves like soldiers, each one promising to whisk you into dreamland with the turn of a corkscrew. You linger in front of a display marked boldly in crimson letters: Patent Sleep Remedies, Guaranteed Rest, or your penny back. Here begins your education in the carnival of powders, pills, and syrups that thrived in an age where regulation was laughably thin. These little miracles were sold not only in chemist shops, but also by traveling peddlers, railway kiosks, and glossy adverts tucked between the gossip columns. The promise was always the same. Take one, and your brain will hush, your eyelids will droop, and you will wake refreshed and renewed, ready to face another day of Victorian hustle. One mainstream fact about this period is that Britain had virtually no consumer protection laws for most of the 19th century. This meant anyone with a mortar, pestle, and a flair for advertising could declare themselves a pharmacist and sell pills made of whatever powder happened to be cheap. You, the desperate insomniac, would never know whether you were swallowing chalk, quinine, opium, or just colored sugar. Some remedies even contained strychnine in safe doses, a phrase that should never exist in polite conversation, let alone in a bedtime ritual. Imagine the labels: Dr. Crampton's nightly restorative pellets, Lady Somner's soothing pastilles, Professor Bright's dream-inducing lozenges. Each package bore not just promises but testimonials: smiling gentlemen claiming they'd slept like babies, swooning women insisting their nerves had calmed overnight. Of course, you realize, many of those glowing reviews were written by the manufacturers themselves. But who could resist when insomnia had hollowed out their cheeks and darkened the skin beneath their eyes? And here's where things get quirky. Some remedies relied on sheer imagination. Sugar pills coated in lavender oil, marketed as nature's hypnotic. Others added bizarre ingredients like lettuce seed extract or powdered stag's horn, sold under the notion that if deer could rest peacefully in the forest, surely their bones must contain the secret. Imagine yourself swallowing a stag's horn tablet while muttering, "Well, it worked for Bambi, so why not me?" Historians still argue whether Victorian consumers genuinely believed these pills worked, or whether they embraced them as rituals, a kind of nightly placebo, part of the theater of sleep. After all, sometimes the act of taking something, even a chalk pellet, creates the calm expectation of slumber, and that expectation alone becomes powerful. You, clutching your box of dream lozenges, can't quite decide whether you're buying medicine or hope. The shopkeeper slides a small tin across the counter toward you. It rattles softly, like dice in a cup. "Two before bed," he advises, "and you'll drift like a babe." You nod solemnly, though your eyes flick to the warnings. Oh wait, there aren't any. In Victorian advertising, side effects rarely make the page. What does appear are ornate engravings of crescent moons, cherubs, and serene faces draped in velvet curtains of sleep. Packaging is half the cure, after all. You leave the apothecary and step back into the misty street, tin of pills hidden in your pocket like contraband. At home, you shake them into your palm, little white discs dusted with powder. The first one tastes of bitter chalk, the second faintly of mint. You lie down, hopeful, waiting for the magic to begin. And nothing. Or maybe something. Perhaps your eyelids droop for a moment, or maybe you just want to believe they do. In either case, the ritual itself becomes comforting, like a bedtime prayer whispered in pill form. But here's the darker truth. Not all remedies were harmless sugar. Many sleeping powders contained opium in disguise, or morphine, or even early forms of bromide. At first, you might find relief, your mind finally muffled, your body sinking into oblivion. Yet the next night you crave the same relief again, and soon the remedy becomes the problem. Victorian newspapers occasionally carried stories of respectable gentlemen wasting away, their nerves shattered not by sleeplessness, but by dependence on the very pills meant to cure it. And still the market thrived. Because what else could you do at 3 in the morning, pacing beside your sputtering candle, while the rest of the household slumbered? When you can't bear another lecture about your overheated brain, when warm milk fails, when prayer feels hollow, you reach for the tin, swallow, and hope. That tiny rattle in your pocket becomes the sound of reassurance, a lullaby in metal disguise. Perhaps the most fascinating part is how modern it all feels. Swap out the Victorian labels for glossy pharmacy brands, trade cherubs for sleek logos, and suddenly you're staring at your own bedside drawer. That continuity, that eternal human hunger for a pill to solve the night, is what makes you smile, even through the haze of exhaustion. Different packaging, same restless souls. So you close your eyes, uncertain whether you'll drift, but at least certain you've done something. And in the Victorian age, sometimes the ritual of trying mattered as much as the cure. The tin of patent pills lies forgotten on your bedside table tonight because someone wiser, or perhaps just more persuasive, has convinced you to try something stronger. A neat little glass bottle, corked and sealed with red wax, glints in the lamplight. Its label is written in elegant copperplate, laudanum, tincture of opium, with spirit of wine. To you, it looks less like medicine and more like a gentleman's evening cordial. You uncork it, and the air fills with a sharp, medicinal sweetness that clings to the nostrils. 1 teaspoon in water, they say, and sleep will come. Laudanum is everywhere in Victorian life. One mainstream fact worth holding on to. It was legal, cheap, and considered as ordinary as aspirin is today. Mothers gave it to their children, laborers swigged it after long days, and poets practically lived on it. You picture yourself in some literary tavern, raising a glass of the brown liquid alongside Coleridge or De Quincey, both of whom turned their insomnia into opium-laden epics. The idea wasn't simply to sleep, it was to slip into a dream world lush with visions. Your first sip burns. It tastes bitter, almost metallic, with the tang of alcohol wrapping the opium's earthy weight. Almost immediately, you feel the edges of wakefulness soften. The ticking clock dulls, the creak of the floorboards fades, and your mind, so restless a moment ago, begins to sway like a boat on a slow tide. For once, you think, perhaps the cure is finally within reach. But here's the quirky side. Some Victorians didn't stop at a teaspoon. They dosed themselves liberally, treating laudanum like a nightcap, even a social drink. Recipes circulated for laudanum-laced cordials, opium stirred into sherry, port, or even hot toddies. Housewives kept small bottles in their sewing baskets. Some gentlemen carried ornate laudanum flasks, engraved with initials, as though insomnia were simply another occasion to display wealth. Imagine pulling one out at a dinner party and offering your companions a drop for the nerves. Historians still argue whether laudanum was more of a medical tool or a cultural habit. Was it prescribed too casually by doctors desperate for results? Or was it demanded by patients who had tasted its relief and refused to give it up? The truth likely lies in the messy middle, a mixture of genuine faith in its powers and a dangerous underestimation of its addictive grip. You, sipping in your dim room, don't bother with the debate. Your eyelids are already heavy, your limbs warm, your thoughts a little too loose. Of course, the relief is never perfect. Some nights laudanum offers oblivion, other nights it teases you with uneasy dreams. You might find yourself wandering through vivid landscapes, strange gardens, endless corridors, shadowy figures whispering half-familiar phrases. And then you wake, pulse racing, heart pounding, as though the dreams themselves had worked harder than wakefulness ever could. Victorians called these visions opium phantasms, and some even sought them deliberately. Writers believed the drug opened doors to creativity, even as it chained the body in dependence. You roll onto your back and think of the apothecary who sold you this cure. Did he measure your teaspoon carefully, or was he too busy selling another bottle to a weary mother cradling a crying infant? Because laudanum, for all its promises, had no fixed dosage. Strength varied wildly between batches, and so one night's relief could be another night's overdose. Countless quiet tragedies unfolded in this way. Sleep sought, life lost. And yet, the bottle still waits on your table tomorrow night, because once you've tasted the possibility of slumber, you cannot easily go back to pacing the floorboards in despair. That's the trap. Laudanum makes insomnia feel optional, something you can control with a corkscrew. Until, of course, you can't. Imagine yourself joining a polite gathering the next day, your bottle discreetly hidden in your coat pocket. Around you, friends complain of sleeplessness, nerves, palpitations. One woman swears by chamomile tea, another by a brisk walk, another by warm brandy. You smile faintly, knowing you hold the true key to rest. But when the headache creeps back, when your hands shake just a little, when your mind whispers that perhaps you need more than yesterday's teaspoon, you realize the line between cure and curse is blurred. For now, though, you set the bottle aside and sink into your pillow. The candle guttering on the mantelpiece bends into strange shapes. The city hum outside softens into a lull. Whether you are truly resting or merely sedated hardly matters anymore. Sleep, or something resembling it, has finally arrived. The cork on your laudanum bottle still smells faintly bitter when you walk into another Victorian curiosity. The backroom of a chemist's shop where bottles of chloroform sit like tiny secrets. If laudanum feels like a slow tide pulling you out to sea, chloroform is a hammer wrapped in velvet, dropping suddenly over your head. The Victorians adored it, not only for surgeries and tooth extractions, but also for the tantalizing promise that it could erase insomnia in one deep breath. One mainstream fact: chloroform became publicly famous in 1853, when Queen Victoria herself reportedly used it during childbirth. That royal endorsement transformed it from a dangerous novelty into a fashionable household tool. After all, if it was good enough for the Queen, surely it was good enough for your weary nerves. Soon, chemists and street vendors alike began whispering about its powers, slipping little vials into brown paper packages labeled night drafts. The process is simple, if reckless. You soak a handkerchief in a few drops of the liquid, lift it gingerly to your face, and breathe in. The fumes are sharp, sweet, and oddly fruity, stinging the nose as though candied plums had gone slightly rotten. At first your chest tightens, then, like a candle snuffed, you tumble into darkness. No tossing, no turning, no racing thoughts. Just gone. Here's the quirky part. Some Victorian households began keeping chloroform beside the bed, as casually as a glass of water. A restless husband might dabble with it after supper. A fashionable lady, nervous before a party, might sneak a whiff to refresh her nerves. Cartoonists of the era even poked fun at this habit. Sketching characters collapsed in armchairs with handkerchiefs pressed theatrically to their faces. Imagine living in a world where your neighbors nonchalantly drug themselves into unconsciousness, then boast the next day of their best night's rest. Historians still argue whether people genuinely believed chloroform safe for casual insomnia, or whether its recreational use was confined to small, eccentric circles. Some accounts suggest chemists refused to sell it except by prescription, while others describe it being hawked openly in market stalls. The truth likely depends on class and region. In one city, chloroform might be locked away. In another, it might be whispered about like the latest fashion in hats. You, of course, are curious. You hold the bottle in your hand, weighing its promise against its danger. The temptation is overwhelming. After weeks of pacing the floorboards, of restless sheets and anxious sighs, wouldn't you risk a little darkness for peace? You uncork the vial and feel the scent leap toward you, chemical and sticky sweet. A scrap of linen soaks it up, and as you press it tentatively against your face, your vision shivers. The room tilts, your pulse echoes, and then silence. But chloroform is fickle. Sometimes it lulls you gently. Other times it steals more than a night. There are quiet tales of Victorians who never woke, their hearts stilled by one breath too many. Families grieved in whispers, often blaming weak constitutions rather than the bottle on the nightstand. And yet the craze persisted, because insomnia is cruel and desperation makes gamblers of us all. When you wake, if you're lucky enough to wake, you feel heavy, sluggish, as though your limbs are stuffed with damp sand. The fog lingers in your head through breakfast, muting conversation into dull hums. And still, part of you considers doing it again. Because compared to endless nights of sleeplessness, even a dangerous silence feels like salvation. As you step back into the morning light, you notice the shopkeepers setting out fresh advertisements. Powders, pills, tonics, tinctures. Chloroform may be extreme, but in the Victorian imagination, it's simply another stop on the restless carousel of cures. And you, still drowsy, realize you've barely begun to sample the century's repertoire of remedies, each one stranger, riskier, and somehow more alluring than the last. You drift into a dim, wood-paneled parlor that smells faintly of ozone and old varnish, where a gleaming brass contraption sits beneath a green-shaded lamp like a steampunk shrine. A placard reads, "Electrotherapeutic Restorative, End Sleeplessness by Gentle Currents." You approach with the same mixture of curiosity and weary hope that guided you through the apothecary and the laudanum bottle. After all, if pills, opiates, and chloroform could be bought off a shelf, why not electricity? It seems modern, precise, something the century trusts. One mainstream fact: by the mid-19th century, galvanic and faradic machines were indeed used in medical practice across Europe. Doctors applied electric currents to treat a range of complaints, from paralysis to nervous exhaustion. Those machines buzz and click as a technician fusses with knobs, testing the intensity. You feel a small thrill. The sound itself promises progress. The magnetotherapists, sellers of magnetic belts, plates, and sleeping mattresses embedded with iron filings, speak confidently about polarity and nerve toning, and the language makes your knees go soft. You sit in a reclining chair, and the attendant straps a soft leather band around your wrists and ankles. A woolen pad, studded with tiny magnets, is placed under your neck. The machine hums a low, sympathetic vibration that settles into the bones. A faint prickle runs down your skin as the current begins, like the ghost of 1,000 tiny fingers tracing the inside of your arms. It is oddly intimate, electric and personal. For a moment you forget the laudanum's honeyed danger and the chloroform's sudden darkness. The contraption seems almost kind. And yet, there is a fringe to all this polish. Some practitioners promise that their magnets will pull nightmares from the brain like pins, leaving a blank, restful field in their wake. Others claim that sleeping with a magnet under your pillow will rearrange your dreams entirely, producing only pastoral visions of sheep and ponds. You imagine yourself, head heavy on a magnetized pillow, dreaming only of gentle hills. What a marketing copy. The more extravagant devices promise to magnetize the will. A phrase that would make your ancestors squint, and yet here you are, willing to try anything. Historians still argue whether the therapeutic effects of these electrical treatments were physiological or psychosocial, whether the currents genuinely altered nerve function, or whether the elaborate ritual and the patient's belief did the real work. You, strapped to the chair, do not have to pick a side. The hum settles under your skin, the world recedes, and sleep, at least a thin, restorative kind, arrives as if on schedule. The attendant occasionally adjusts a dial, and you feel the prickles sharpen then soften. You are warned that too much current will produce severe twitching. Too little, and it will be ineffective. This calibration, this intimacy with a machine, feels oddly modern. It is not unlike plugging in a white noise machine tonight and dialing it to just the right volume. You think of your app-filled phone back in your pocket, of the glowing sleep trackers, and wearables people strapped to their wrists now to coax rest. Technology promising to quantify calm. The comparison is gentle and a little unnerving. Centuries change, but the urge to let a gadget do the settling remains familiar. There are other oddities. A popular novelty involves sleeping chairs that recline and gently rock while an attached coil emits intermittent sparks. Some insist the sparks cleanse the mind, an electrified purgation, if you will. You recline in one such chair, the leather cool beneath you, a small thunder in the air as the coil arcs. The rocking is slight, almost maternal, the sparks crackle like distant summer storms, and you think of how lullabies can be made of very different things. A mother's hum, a machine's pulse, a city's hush. Then there are the electric belts, which people wear around their middles as if girdled by a new age armor. Promised benefits include better digestion, calmer nerves, and, crucially, deeper sleep. Salesmen demonstrate by placing a belt on a burly man in the shop window who promptly pretends to relax into a placid, theatrical repose. You suspect some of the demonstrations are stagecraft, but conviction is persuasive. A patient's belief can be a gentle anesthetic, a convincing salesman, an unlicensed priest. Still, not all effects are benign. There are reports of burns where the straps rub, of nights spent jittering with involuntary muscle twitches after an overzealous session. The machines, after all, are imitations of the body's electricity, and imitating anything as delicate as nerve function invites error. Yet the community of users multiplies. They trade tips in polite magazines. One should not be electrified on a full stomach, warns a prudently printed letter, nor when overly fatigued. You laugh softly at the specificity, because your own attempts at regulation, teaspoons of laudanum, a cautious sniff of chloroform, a handful of patent pills, mapped into equally particular rules. Amid this spectacle, a quieter subset preaches magnetic rings and loops, tiny iron circlets worn on the finger, or magnets stitched into nightcaps. Friends trade gossip about which brands offered balanced polarity, and which were likely mere magnetized knickknacks. Some even recommend placing a lodestone under the mattress to ward off nightmares. You press your ear against the headboard and imagine a tiny stone, ancient and cold, tugging stray thoughts down into the earth where they can no longer bother you. The parlor conversation slides into anecdote. An elderly lady swears that since wearing a copper cross and sleeping with a magnet under her pillow, she has not had a lucid nightmare in 5 years. A skeptical cousin recounts how a neighbor jolted awake mid-treatment, declaring that the currents had arranged her dreams into a neat procession of household chores, cleaning, ironing, cataloging, rather than imaginative landscapes. The two debates, between believers and skeptics, sound familiar in any era. One side claims science's promise, the other warns of theatrical consolation. You leave the clinic with your hair slightly disheveled and a pamphlet promising a home electro set for 1 guinea. The price is not inconsiderable, but the idea of replicating that low hum beneath your sheets is intoxicating. Why not buy a small coil, a few magnets, and a leather band? After all, you have tried tea, pills, laudanum, and chloroform. Technology feels like a dignified next step, less shameful than opium, less lethal than chloroform, more respectable than patent powders. A neighbor brags she has traded laudanum for nightly magnet sessions and feels fresher, while another shows a faint pink mark where a strap once burned her skin. A new ritual forms. You calibrate dials with the same solemnity earlier generations measured doses. Counting clicks becomes a private liturgy, and you catch yourself wondering whether you've simply swapped one anxious habit for another. Technology, it seems, has its own compulsions. Salons buzz with opinion. Some physicians hail electrotherapy as modern medicine finally taking nerves seriously. Others dismiss it as stylish quackery. Historians still argue whether these machines were a medical breakthrough or a fashionable overlay on older ideas about nerves. For you, tonight's result is what matters. A low hum under the pillow, a mechanical chorus that softens the edges of thought. You climb the stairs, the clinician's pamphlet tucked beside the laudanum receipt and the chloroform cork, small relics of a long night's commerce. Sliding the magnet under your pillow, you notice how every cure you have tried is an attempt to close the same restless loop, to make the world stop long enough for sleep to find you. The coil does not promise mystical oblivion. It offers measured easing, a slow dissolving of tension into a gentle, regulated tide. As the vibration hums through your skull, you let the city's clamor recede, and for once, you drift toward morning with a soft, mechanized peace. You wake to the faint taste of iron on your tongue and the low hum of last night's coil still echoing in your bones. The magnets have done their part, or at least convinced you they have, and now a new suggestion floats through the parlor gossip. Why not let food itself become the cure? Not in the comforting sense of warm milk at bedtime, but in the calculated, almost ritualistic Victorian style of dietary sleep therapy. Doctors begin insisting that digestion is the key to calm nerves, and so you wander toward the kitchen, eyeing bread loaves with newfound suspicion. The mainstream fact is this: Victorian physicians frequently recommended bland, starchy suppers, arrowroot biscuits, oatmeal gruel, barley water, believing these would soothe the stomach and in turn the mind. Meat-heavy dinners, they warned, cause the body to steam with excess vitality, leaving nerves jangling until dawn. So you try it. You imagine yourself spooning tepid gruel into your mouth, the texture gummy, the flavor non-existent. The heat is mild, not indulgent, not spicy, just enough to warm your belly like a coal left in the grate. You wait for the slow settling, that promise that the mind will follow the body's lead into stillness. But of course, as with every supposed solution, you discover contradictions. One physician insists an egg before bed provides the perfect sedative protein. Another swears eggs are stimulants, good only in the morning. Historians still argue whether these recommendations were based on genuine observation or merely Victorian moralizing against indulgence and spice. The quirky fringe enters quickly. Pamphlets promoting lettuce as a natural soporific. You read about lacticarium, the milky latex extracted from wild lettuce, sometimes called lettuce opium. Imagine the seriousness with which someone could chew through a pile of leaves, believing that each crunch brought them closer to slumber. You sit at your table, a bowl of limp lettuce before you, and nibble with exaggerated solemnity. You picture yourself dosing up on salad, thinking, only in this century could lettuce be considered narcotic. There are others who swear by onions. Some recommend roasting one, placing it on the bedside table, and inhaling the vapors as if they were an olfactory lullaby. You picture your bedroom filled with the pungent sweetness of baked onion, your pillow dampened by the smell, and you laugh softly at the absurdity. Yet in some quarters, it is gospel truth. The humble onion as guardian against insomnia's grip. Milk has its place too, though not the way you imagine. Warmed with nutmeg, sometimes fortified with a spoon of brandy, it becomes a potion straddling nourishment and narcotic. You sip it slowly, the nutmeg dust clinging to your lips, and wonder if the comfort you feel comes from chemistry or memory. The echo of childhood, a glass pressed into your small hand before bed. The conversation circles around stimulants as well. Coffee is condemned outright, tea too in certain doses. Yet some argue that a weak infusion of chamomile or valerian root, technically teas themselves, are soothing. You note the irony. One infusion jolts you awake, another lulls you to sleep, both prepared with the same ceremony. You brew a chamomile, the steam curling upward, fragrant with faint apple. The first sip is grassy, grounding, almost boring, but boring is good. Boring means the mind slows. Then come the stranger fads, vinegar tonics, believed to cool the blood, or gelatin desserts, recommended for their digestive neutrality. You imagine a wobbly mound of translucent jelly, quivering under the candlelight, a culinary lullaby in shimmering form. The Victorians could turn even dessert into a sleeping pill. The kitchen table becomes a kind of laboratory. Each night you test a new food, noting its effect with the solemnity of a scientist. Did the onion vapor work? Did the lettuce induce softness behind the eyes? Did the milk and brandy warm the nerves into submission? Sometimes you drift easily. Sometimes you lie awake with a belly full of starch and nothing else. But the ritual matters, the spoon, the sip, the chewing, because ritual itself soothes. And here, amid the bowls and kettles, you glimpse the continuity between centuries. Today people still speak of sleep hygiene, of avoiding heavy meals, of sipping herbal teas at bedtime. Your chamomile sachet is a descendant of their wildflower brews, your glass of warm milk and air to their nutmeg-spiced potion. The difference lies mostly in branding and packaging. The human need is unchanged. The grand irony is that some nights the gruel, the lettuce, and the nutmeg all fail, and hunger itself becomes a lullaby. A few physicians advised going to bed hungry, convinced that emptiness calmed the system more than fullness. You lie down, stomach faintly aching, wondering if this deprivation will coax sleep. It does sometimes, but it feels like a cruel joke, to rest at the cost of comfort. Still, you persist, because the promise of sleep always outweighs the absurdity of the method. Each plate, each sip, becomes part of the great Victorian menu for the weary, an edible prayer whispered against the noise of wakefulness. You leave the kitchen behind, the taste of nutmeg and onion still lingering faintly, and wander into a quieter chamber where the remedies look less like meals and more like machines. Here, in the corner of a tidy drawing room, stands something that resembles a shrunken greenhouse filled with glass tubing and copper piping. A small dial winks, a pump wheezes, and a faint mist curls out, scented faintly of lavender. This is no garden contraption. It is a Victorian inhalation device, a cousin to the tonics and tinctures you have been sampling, but meant to be breathed rather than swallowed. The mainstream fact is this: 19th century physicians often prescribed inhalations of substances like bromine, ether vapors, or simply steam infused with herbs, believing that the lungs could deliver sedatives more efficiently to the nervous system. In fact, bromides became a cornerstone of Victorian medicine, introduced in the 1850s and widely used as sleep aids for decades. You imagine holding a funnel to your face, warm vapor tickling your skin, as you draw slow breaths designed to soften every sharp edge of wakefulness. But the fringe spins wild. Some inventors boast of sleeping machines that pump ozonized air into bedrooms, insisting that purified, electrified atmosphere will settle the racing mind. One pamphlet illustrates a married couple beneath a bell jar, the air within supposedly neutralized of irritant particles. You picture yourself lying under glass like some human specimen, breathing curated air until unconsciousness claims you. Historians still argue whether these contraptions were genuine attempts at medical innovation or elaborate stunts to sell the era's fascination with electricity and chemistry. And the smells, the smells. Lavender oil diffusers, rosewood chips, even heated vinegar poured into basins at bedside. A lady swears by crushed hops sewn into her pillow. She insists the bitter odor alone is enough to coax the brain into quiet. You lean into such a pillow, the scent acrid and sharp, and wonder if the cure is in the chemical or in the ritual act of believing, of laying your head down knowing that you have surrounded yourself with medicine, even if invisible. The devices grow stranger. Some are pocket-sized inhalers, brass tubes you carry discreetly and press to your lips in a crowded parlor when nerves begin to fray. You draw in a breath of camphor, of valerian, of chloroform-infused vapor, and exhale with a sigh that suggests calm, even if the calm lasts only a handful of minutes. Others resemble hookahs, elaborate and theatrical, their hoses draped like serpents across the floor, promising an evening of shared sedation among friends. You sit at such a gathering, passing the tube, watching the sweet smoke coil into the air, and for a moment the insomnia feels like a communal sport rather than a private misery. Not all inhalations are gentle. Some physicians advise chlorine or iodine vapor, convinced that stimulating the lungs paradoxically forces the body into eventual rest. You cough through an acrid breath, eyes watering, chest burning, and yet your companions assure you that relief lies only a few more inhalations away. The cure is always just around the corner, and sometimes the corner is sharp enough to scrape your lungs raw. You notice, too, how these inhalation rituals echo the kitchen's rituals. Instead of sipping warm milk, you breathe warm steam. Instead of crunching lettuce, you crush herbs into vapor. The hands busy themselves, the senses engage, and in that act of preparation the body learns to anticipate sleep. You wonder if it is not the chemical at all but the ceremony, the way fire, water, and breath are arranged into a nightly liturgy. Tonight, you experiment with hops. You boil them in water, inhale the rising bitterness, then stuff the damp flowers into a small pouch to rest under your pillow. The room smells like a brewery, thick and earthy. You lie back, eyes closed, chest still warm from the vapor, and wait. The hops do not drown you in instant sleep, but they muffle the edges of thought, as though someone draped a coarse cloth over the mind's incessant chatter. And isn't that what you crave? Not oblivion, not chloroform's sudden blankness, but muffling, a softening of corners, a dulled horizon that invites you to sink. In this room of glass tubes and steaming bowls, you discover the slowest, most human cure. To breathe deliberately, to let the body's rhythm remind the brain how to yield. You rise from the haze of hops and lavender, your lungs still tingling, and shuffle toward a room that looks more like a child's nursery than a laboratory. Here, shelves sag with jars of curious powders, each promising to calm the restless mind if only taken at the right hour. Some powders gleam pearly white, others glow faintly pink or amber, and each label reads like a whisper of hope. The mainstream fact is this: by the latter half of the 19th century, bromide salts, especially potassium bromide, were the standard prescription for insomnia. Doctors believed bromides subdued nervous excitability, calming everything from epilepsy to sleeplessness. So you stir a spoonful into a glass of water, the liquid tasting faintly metallic, almost mineral, and swallow with a grimace. The sedative effect, slow and steady, seeps into the edges of thought. The world feels blurred, softened. For the first time in days, you lie down with the possibility of dream. But like all remedies, bromides carry a shadow. Overuse leads to bromism, a condition marked by rashes, dizziness, and even hallucinations. Some patients describe a persistent fog, as though they walk through their waking hours wrapped in damp wool. You imagine yourself shuffling through foggy Victorian streets, not sure whether you are asleep or awake, a ghost haunting your own life. Historians still argue whether doctors recognized the dangers too late, or whether they simply chose to overlook them in their desperation to calm patients' nerves. Beyond bromides, the fringe powders pile high. Sulfonal, trional, veronal, synthetic sedatives that appear at the century's end, each hailed as a miracle before their risks surface. You picture a pharmacist sliding a paper twist of sulfonal across the counter, his expression solemn but eager. He assures you it will smooth the pulse, but you can almost see the tremor in his hand, the quiet uncertainty about what this powder truly does. One patient swears by chloral hydrate, the so-called knockout drops of its time. Mixed into wine or tea, the crystals dissolve invisibly, and soon the drinker drifts into heavy, dreamless slumber. You try it once, the sweetness of wine masking the medicine, and feel yourself dropping like a stone into black water. It works too well, so well that waking feels like climbing from the bottom of a lake, lungs tight, head buzzing. You shiver, remembering that too much chloral has ended more lives than it saved. The powders vary in glamour. Some come packaged in dainty tins with embossed lettering, marketed especially for delicate ladies. Others arrive in plain envelopes, bulk and unremarkable, for the working classes who can afford only the raw stuff. No matter the package, the effect is the same: chemical silence poured into the bloodstream. There is a quirky tidbit about sulfonal. Patients sometimes reported their urine turning pink, a side effect that seemed almost magical in its strangeness. You imagine housewives comparing shades in whispered conversation, as though sharing a secret code. "Mine was rose-colored last night," one says proudly, as though proof that the powder is doing its mysterious work. The powders also create rituals of measurement. You sit at your desk, weighing out crystals with a tiny brass scale, the needle trembling as you try not to spill. A grain too much could mean oversleeping until noon, a grain too little, another night of torment. The precision makes you nervous, but it also gives you a sense of control. You wonder if the act of careful weighing is as soothing as the medicine itself. And then comes the marketing. Advertisements boast that these powders are scientific, a word heavy with authority in an age dazzled by chemistry. They promise not just sleep, but restorative sleep, the kind that renews the soul. You shake your head, smiling at the sales pitch, and yet here you are, sprinkling another measure into your glass. Science and hope are the same flavor tonight. As the powder slides down your throat, you wonder about your modern self. How different is it, really, to swallow a melatonin capsule or an over-the-counter sleep aid, purchased in a glossy box that whispers safety? Both eras crave certainty. Both ignore the uneasy truth that chemistry is never truly gentle. The powders blur your edges, your thoughts slow, and for a while, the night feels merciful. But you know the bargain. Tomorrow you may wake foggy, heavy, uncertain of where the dream ended and the day began. Still, you accept it. In the Victorian cabinet of sleep, powders are the closest thing to magic dust, scattered across your restless pillow. You stagger out of the powder-filled nursery with your head still buzzing, the air tinged with the metallic taste of bromides and the cloying aftertaste of chloral wine. The fog follows you down a narrow corridor where the wallpaper grows darker, patterned with twining vines and serpentine leaves. At the end of the hall is a chamber with plush curtains and a recliner, so inviting you almost sink into it without thinking. A handbill on the table announces tonight's lecture: Hypnosis for Nervous Sleeplessness. The mainstream fact is that Victorian physicians like James Braid and later Jean-Martin Charcot experimented seriously with hypnosis, believing it could calm hysteria, pain, and yes, insomnia. So you settle back in the chair as the practitioner, a stern man with a heavy brow, fixes his eyes on yours. He swings a pocket watch gently, side to side, murmuring in tones meant to soften your breath and narrow your focus. You feel your eyelids grow heavy, not because of magic, but because of rhythm, repetition, and the oddly soothing monotony of his voice. Then the fringe sweeps in. Some mesmerists claim they channel animal magnetism, invisible currents flowing from their fingers into your nervous system. One woman describes it as a hand of cool air pressing upon the brain. Another insists she could feel her dreams being rearranged by the magnetist's will, like a deck of cards shuffled into order. You shiver at the thought, comforted, unsettled, intrigued. Historians still argue whether mesmerism was genuine therapy, clever suggestion, or simply theater staged for desperate patients. The room itself feels like theater. Gaslight flickers, shadows dance, and the hypnotist's watch gleams like a miniature moon. You hear the slow command. Your limbs grow heavy, your mind is drifting. And even as you think it's silly, your body obeys. Perhaps this is the real trick. You want it to work, so it does, and the stories multiply. Some patients claim they fell into a hypnotic trance, so deep they slept through thunderstorms. Others report that suggestion alone, "You will not wake until morning," was enough to silence the night terrors. You imagine a mother whispering such words to her child, transforming maternal comfort into medical ritual. The quirky details make you smile. Itinerant hypnotists advertised sleep shows where they put volunteers into trances on stage, sometimes leaving them snoring theatrically while the audience clapped. One pamphlet even promised that wives could learn self-hypnosis to escape household worries, drifting into virtuous slumber despite noisy husbands or crying infants. You picture a Victorian parlor full of women staring at swinging trinkets, trying to will themselves into peaceful oblivion. But not all experiences are serene. Some describe waking from hypnosis more agitated than before, their nerves jangling as though shaken by invisible strings. Others fear surrendering control entirely. What if the mesmerist plants a suggestion you never shake? What if your dreams are no longer your own, yet still you submit to the ritual? The watch swings, the voice drones, and your thoughts untangle like thread unwinding from a spool. You feel yourself slip toward the edge of something, sleep, trance, suggestion, maybe all at once. When you stir again, minutes or hours later, the hypnotist smiles knowingly as though he alone holds the key to your rest. Walking home afterward, you laugh softly. You've tried opium, chloroform, magnets, lettuce, bromides, and now the hypnotist's watch. Each remedy wears a different costume, bottle, coil, spoon, vapor, spell, but all chase the same phantom. And tonight, with your body still strangely heavy from the suggestion, you admit the oddest thing. Perhaps the mind itself has always been the real cure, tricked into surrendering by whatever story it is willing to believe. You leave the mesmerist's parlor, the faint swing of his watch still ghosting in your vision, and step into another chamber lit not by lamps or candles, but by the flicker of a tiny flame on a glass contraption. The smell is sharp, resinous, smoky, faintly metallic. A row of curious objects lines the mantel. Little pastilles shaped like coins, blocks of resin ready to be set alight, and small clay burners puffing tendrils of smoke into the air. This is the world of Victorian fumigations and incense, where insomnia is chased not by swallowing or sipping, but by saturating the air you breathe. The mainstream fact is that 19th century households often burned resins like frankincense or benzoin, and physicians sometimes prescribed fumigation of camphor, henbane, or even opium as a sedative. You lean close to one such burner and feel the smoke lick your cheek, warm and oddly comforting. Inhaling slowly, you catch notes of spice, sweetness, bitterness, a perfume designed to still the pulse. For a moment, the room becomes a sanctuary, every curl of smoke a rope tugging you deeper into quiet. But fringe claims abound. One pamphlet insists that burning a mixture of asafoetida and vinegar will cleanse the brain of nervous vapors. Another swears by tossing crushed poppy heads onto glowing coals to produce dreams of extraordinary vividness. You wrinkle your nose at the acrid stench of asafoetida, pungent enough to wake the dead, let alone lull the living. Still, people swore it worked, even as neighbors complained about the smell seeping through shared walls. Historians still argue whether these practices had genuine pharmacological effects or whether the atmosphere alone, the darkness, the ritual of lighting a flame, was enough to calm restless minds. You pick up a block of benzoin resin, sticky to the touch, and toss it onto the burner. It crackles, releasing a cloud that smells faintly of vanilla and old wood. The smoke rises in lazy spirals, filling corners, softening edges, as though the room itself is falling asleep. You find your breathing slowing, your eyelids drooping, the rhythm of inhale and exhale syncing with the dance of smoke. And then the quirky details arrive. Some Victorians believed fumigation worked best if the sleeper's head was covered by a tent of blankets, trapping the smoke directly around the face. You imagine yourself crouched under heavy quilts, sweating and half suffocated, trying to convince yourself the dizziness is actually drowsiness. Others recommended filling entire bedrooms with burning herbs, claiming the household spirits themselves would be soothed into silence. It was less medicine, more exorcism. The contradictions are constant. One doctor warns that fumigations irritate the lungs, provoking coughs rather than calming them. Another claims the irritation is the point, that the body, forced to expend its energy fighting the vapors, eventually collapses into sleep. The logic feels twisted, but then so do your own thoughts at 3 in the morning when nothing else has worked. Still, you notice the ritual itself has power. Lighting a pastille, watching it glow and fade, creates a rhythm. The smell anchors you in the present moment, dragging your mind away from the day's endless loops. Isn't that what modern people do with scented candles or diffusers of lavender oil? The object has changed. The principle is the same. You sit in the haze until your hair smells of smoke and your clothes are infused with resin. You picture yourself later slipping between sheets that reek faintly of frankincense, carrying the scent like a cloak into your dreams. And for once, the air itself feels like medicine, as if sleep has been brewed not in a cup or capsule, but in the very atmosphere you breathe. The flame dies down, the burner cools, and the smoke thins into nothing. You stretch, a little groggy but calmer than before, wondering if the secret is not the substance burned, but the act of letting something else, resin, smoke, ritual, carry your wakefulness away. You move from the fragrant smoke of benzoin into a smaller, warmer room where a long oak table holds plates of cheese, cold meat, and pickles, leftovers arranged like tiny guilty pleasures. Tonight's advice comes not from a physician but from the housekeeper, who taps the table with a wooden spoon and says, with the certainty of someone who has seen many nights, "Never eat cheese before bed." You look at the wedges with a kind of mournful hunger. In this century, as in many others, what you eat before sleep is a small, anxious experiment. One mainstream fact anchors the conversation. Victorian doctors and diet reformers often believed that certain foods, cheese, oysters, rich gravies, and heavy meats, were liable to cause indigestion, which they in turn blamed for restless nights and vivid nightmares. The digestive system was supposed to compete for the body's energies. If digestion worked too hard while you slept, the nerves might be distracted and the mind unsettled. Thus entire pamphlets told readers to favor bland suppers and to finish eating several hours before bed so the stomach might settle. You begin experimenting with bedtime meals as if they are medical trials. Tonight you eat a slice of dry toast and a cup of barley water, the blandness conspiring to make everything else more noticeable. You lie back waiting for some steady descent into sleep. Sometimes it works. On other nights, the toast sits like a pebble in your chest, and your mind tumbles anyway. The protocol becomes ritual. Prepare the broth, let it cool, sit quietly a while. Oddly enough, the ritual itself soothes. Hands busy, senses slowed, expectation altered. And sometimes that is the difference between pacing and slumber. Quirky remedies abound. One pamphlet warns that French cheeses are especially dangerous for imagination and fancy, as if a stinky brie might seed a midnight sonnet. Another suggests placing a thin slice of bread in your boot overnight to absorb nocturnal vapors, and thus preserve the sleeper's dreams. You imagine stepping out in the morning with a salty loaf at your toes. The thought is ridiculous, but the story circulates in kitchens and parlors with the gravitas of old wives' lore and the calm conviction of a household rule. You remember the other cures you've tried: laudanum's warm oblivion, chloroform's dangerous hush, the magnet under the pillow pulling pastoral dreams into alignment. Watching the menu of the household now, you see how treatments and table converge. One offers chemical stillness, the other domestic order. Both promise to arrange the body to allow sleep. Where you once reached for the chemist's tin, you now mind the kettle's heat. Both are attempts at control, whether by vial or spoon. Historians still argue whether Victorian diet prescriptions reflected empirical observation or moralizing impulses cloaked in medical jargon. Some scholars read admonitions about late suppers as ethical advice, discouraging indulgence in an age nervous about consumption and appetite. Others insist physicians were responding to genuine clinical patterns: reflux, indigestion, and nocturnal discomfort did disturb sleep, even if their explanations lacked modern physiology. You lying awake before dawn once too often don't care which label people give the idea. You only care whether the worn rules help. You also see class writ small across the table. For the middle classes, adjusting supper is a manageable remedy. Substitute barley for mutton, set the evening meal earlier, buy chamomile by the ounce. For the poor, those options barely exist. A factory hand's late supper might be whatever is cheapest, most filling, and eaten quickly after a long shift. In such cases, sleeplessness is less a symptom of delicate nerves and more a product of poverty and labor. The capacity to treat sleep by diet is itself a kind of privilege, and the advice that comforts some can feel like blame to others. Midwives and mothers add their own practicalities. They warn against feeding infants sweetened condensed milk at night, advising thin gruels instead. They tell of babies who sleep in between feedings and those who wake because their guts are unsettled. Nursery rhymes pick up the same language. Beware the cheese under the pillow, or the mouse will dine on your dreams. The advice feels tender and slightly comic, but it speaks to a deep, domestic desire to shape the night so the household can rest as a single organism. Physicians, convinced by repeated patterns though limited in instrumentation, notice recurrent symptoms. The sleeper roused by a burning chest, the worker disturbed by pain from a heavy stew, the dreamer whose visions flare after sweetmeats. They cannot measure stomach acid or enzymatic activity the way you can now, but clinical observation accumulates and offers pragmatic guidance. You start to trust that finishing supper earlier and choosing milder foods does reduce your awakenings. It's not an absolute cure. Nobody promises miracles, but it is a modest, manageable nudge toward rest. Fringe ideas persist. Some charlatans sell digestive plates, claim to neutralize excitement. Others promise that a specific spoon or a dish painted with pale glazes will soothe the spirit. One amusing fad promotes moral crockery, arguing that plain earthenware calms the mind by avoiding gaudy patterns that might stimulate appetite and, by extension, dreams. You smile at the thought of beautiful china blamed for vivid REM episodes, yet you also recognize the truth that environment and expectation shape appetite and mood. A plain plate and an unhurried bite can change the rhythm of the evening in ways a bottle seldom can. Dietary advice also becomes a kind of moral theater. To decline a late, rich supper signals discipline and virtue. Women's magazines instruct housewives to schedule meals that foster calm in the household, linking culinary restraint to domestic harmony. The admonitions read less like neutral public health and more like gentle social policing. Watch the table, watch the household, and sleep will follow. Food, then, becomes an instrument of domestic governance as much as physical remedy. You keep a small ledger by the bedside, a modest tally of meals and nights. On good evenings you scrawl. Broth 8 p.m., slept 11. On bad ones, cheese and ale, dreamt of rivers. The ledger becomes a talisman, a thread of tiny experiments that returns agency to you. There's comfort in measurement. There's comfort in choosing to act. The Victorian table, you discover, offers a form of self-care that is slow, inexpensive, and deeply social. It involves hands, heat, and the presence of others. There is an uneasy ally in these conversations: alcohol. Nightcaps are both endorsed and vilified. A small measure of sherry or a brandy-warmed cup of milk is recommended by some as a gentle sedative, while other physicians warn that spirituous drinks fragment sleep, provoking early wakings and anxious dawns. This contradiction is typical of Victorian dietary lore. One doctor's tonic is another's toxin, and you, caught between pamphlets and parlor gossip, adopt a pragmatic stance. You sparingly, observe closely, and note the outcome. Beyond spirits, reform movements add another layer. Vegetarian advocates and temperance societies instruct readers to favor early, plant-based dinners not only for the sake of sleep, but as moral improvement. Hydropathic clinics pair cold compresses with strict menus, promising that water and bland food together will regulate both stomach and nerves. Some regimens read austere, even punitive, yet they endure because they offer a clear plan in an era that otherwise feels chaotic. You try variations. One week you follow a hydropathic schedule with early suppers and cold foot baths. Another week you keep to simple barley broth and chamomile. Results differ, but a pattern emerges. Predictability soothes. Whether the mechanism is physiological or psychosocial, the household routine signals the body that night is for winding down. That signal proves more reliable, in many cases, than any elixir. Then there are the charming superstitions, sympathetic dream foods. Eat oysters and you might dream of the sea. Tuck into roast goose and you might wander through stubble fields. These notions are not scientific, but neither are they harmless. They give people a narrative for their nights, a way to make sense of the otherwise mysterious theater of dreams. At dawn you puzzle over patterns recorded in your ledger. The food rules are partly physiology, partly culture. They are practical and prescriptive, domestic and moral. For tonight, the broth and early hour have done their work. The cheese remains unmolested, a small, pungent monument to restraint, and you sleep with a gentle mind, grateful for the modest, ordinary remedies of the kitchen. Historians still argue whether these domestic dietary regimens produced long-term benefits, or whether they primarily functioned as calming routines that gave anxious sleepers a sense of mastery. For tonight, such debates are academic. The house is still, your ledger lies folded by the bedside, and the wedge of cheese glints in the dark, untouched and reproachful. You draw the blanket up and let the slow silence cradle you into the soft, ordinary dark. You close your eyes with a final, quiet thought. The plate remains pale and empty at your bedside, the wedge of cheese untouched and oddly dignified. Tonight the house-brewed measures win. You sleep with the mild, steady dreams of someone who has eaten modestly and left enough time for digestion to rest. The morning will bring its own troubles, but for now, one more gentle night has been bought by plain food and the slow rituals of a household that has learned to treat the night with care. You wake the next morning to a thin light filtering through lace curtains, and someone has left a folded paper on the bedside table. Its cover reads, "On the Moral Discipline of Sleep." Victorian reformers loved pamphlets almost as much as they loved rules, and this one is filled with tidy prescriptions, written in the clipped certainty of people who believe virtue and health walk hand in hand. You sip lukewarm barley water while flipping pages, and the theme is clear. Insomnia isn't just a medical condition, it's a test of character. One mainstream fact stands out early. Reformers often preached that sleeplessness reflected overindulgence, late suppers, or sinful habits such as alcohol, cards, or lusty novels read by candlelight. The body was imagined as a moral barometer, and a restless night served as punishment or warning. Insomnia thus became a sermon disguised as diagnosis. You are told that if you rise early, avoid rich foods, and keep to godly work, your bed will embrace you like a reward. The pamphlet brims with lists. Wake at dawn, bathe briskly, never linger in bed beyond necessity, avoid gossip, keep the mind industrious but not overstimulated. You laugh at the contradiction. Stay busy, but not too busy. This is the era's constant paradox. Discipline yourself into relaxation, command yourself into surrender. It's like being told, go to sleep right now or else. You already know how well that works. The quirky side of moral advice surfaces quickly. Some authors insist that sewing by lamplight past 9 is dangerous, not for the eyes but for the soul, because fatigue tempts demons of fancy. Another writer, quite serious, claims that indulgence in feather mattresses weakens the will, urging households to return to stiff, hair-stuffed pallets for moral fortitude. You imagine yourself explaining that to your weary bones, and the absurdity nearly makes you chuckle. And yet, discipline does have its seductions. You keep a small routine, tidying shoes, folding garments, laying out tomorrow's stockings. These gestures whisper, the day is finished, and in that quiet completion you sometimes find a path into slumber. Whether it's morality or merely habit, the result is real. You remember the ledger you began while tracking suppers. Now you extend it to your routines. Bed made, light snuffed, small prayer or reflection scribbled, eyes closed. It feels like a spell, one constructed of actions rather than herbs. Historians still argue whether Victorian moral reformers truly believed discipline itself cured sleeplessness, or whether they used sleep as a convenient metaphor for self-control. Some insist that the language of rest mirrored religious concepts of eternal rest, blending theology with physiology. Others point to the growing industrial rhythm of the era. Sleep became something to be managed, optimized, made efficient, just as labor was. You, lying awake in a narrow bed, sense both strands at once, spiritual caution and industrial productivity, braided into one stern bedtime lecture. You wander through households in your imagination. The stern father insisting lights out by 10, the reform-minded mother banning novels in favor of family Bible reading, the young clerk hiding penny dreadfuls under the blanket and earning the sleepless guilt that the pamphlet foretold. Discipline is less about comfort and more about control. For the middle classes, it reassures. If you do everything properly, night will reward you. For the poor, it offers little comfort. After 14 hours of labor, discipline hardly matters when exhaustion itself is the only sedative. Quaint maxims become popular. An idle mind makes a restless pillow. He who rises with the lark rests like the lamb. These sayings drift into everyday chatter, repeated with the same confidence as medical facts. You imagine neighbors comparing routines at the pump, as if bragging about how early they rose secures a badge of virtue. Sleep becomes competitive in its morality. Not who slept the longest, but who earned rest through clean habits. Sometimes you give in and perform the rituals as prescribed. You leave the book aside, dim the lamp early, kneel for a small prayer, and remind yourself sternly that slumber is a duty. And curiously, the sense of duty sometimes works, not because of divine enforcement, but because your brain loves predictability. The irony is delicious. Moral reformers, without knowing it, stumble upon behavioral conditioning. There are stranger branches of reform. Certain pamphlets scold women for staying awake with embroidery or gossip, warning that sleeplessness breeds hysteria. Others target men, linking late-night tavern chatter to broken nerves and shattered households. The message is universal but gendered. Insomnia is both punishment and threat, a sign that you've stepped out of your proper role. You can feel the pressure. Sleep not just for your health, but for your reputation. A curious fringe emerges around Sabbath observance. Some writers insist that keeping Sunday restful ensures better sleep through the week, while violating it will leave you wakeful on Monday nights. It sounds mystical, but it reflects a rhythm of rest baked into the week itself. Whether or not the claim holds water, the pattern of collective downtime probably did shape people's sense of balance. When you picture the earnest reformers, you can't help but smirk. All those sermons about early rising, plain food, hard mattresses. Yet the underlying advice, structure, routine, predictability, still rings true. Modern sleep hygiene repeats the same lines, minus the moral thunder. Dim lights, avoid stimulants, wind down, reserve bed for rest. You wonder if we've simply repackaged moralism as science, a sleeker pamphlet for the 21st century. Tonight, as you blow out the lamp, you feel the weight of the pamphlet's rules. Your stomach is still warm with broth, your mind tethered by routine, your conscience a little smug. And though you roll your eyes at the reformers' severity, you also sense their comfort. The idea that sleeplessness is not random chaos, but a signal you can interpret, a condition you can influence. Historians still argue whether this moralistic approach genuinely reduced insomnia, or whether it merely layered guilt upon those already restless. From your bed, you know the answer lies somewhere in between. A stern pamphlet won't put you to sleep, but sometimes the order it prescribes nudges you closer. You close your eyes, not quite certain whether you're disciplined, duped, or merely lulled by routine. The pamphlet rests folded on the table, patient as a preacher, waiting for you to rise again at dawn. The folded pamphlet lies forgotten now, tucked between a stack of hymnals and old newspapers. Tonight you are in a different room. The the kind with a faint chill that creeps from the floorboards and a wallpaper pattern of faded roses. On the mantel sits something stranger than any moral lecture. A squat tin labeled bromide of potassium for nervous afflictions. Victorian medicine was quick to adopt new chemical discoveries, and bromides, salts of bromine, became some of the most widely prescribed sedatives of the age. One mainstream fact: bromides were first introduced into medical practice in the 1850s and soon hailed as miracle remedies for nervous disorders, epilepsy, and sleeplessness. Physicians appreciated their relative safety compared to opiates, and by the 1880s bromides had become so common that medical journals called them the aspirin of their day. You hold the tin and picture countless households dissolving white powders into water, hoping the calm that followed would quiet the night. But the calm was complicated. At first, you feel it as a heaviness at the edge of thought, a dulling of the chatter that usually clutters your head. The bed seems more inviting, the pillow softer. Yet bromides carried hidden dangers. Used too often, they caused skin eruptions, depression, and what Victorians called bromism, a foggy state of lethargy and confusion. Some sufferers shuffled through days as if underwater, trading insomnia for a slow-motion existence. The quirky advice that traveled with bromide use almost sounds like folk magic. One practitioner suggested stirring the powder only with silver spoons to avoid chemical ill luck. Another insisted that bromides should never be consumed on Fridays, as their effects might linger against the Sabbath spirit. These rules have no grounding in chemistry, of course, but when you are desperate for sleep, even superstition can feel like science. Historians still argue whether bromides genuinely improved lives or merely dulled them. Some scholars highlight how widespread prescription reflected real relief, people finally sleeping after years of torment. Others stress the cost. An entire population moving through life slightly sedated, creativity and vitality blunted by the chemical haze. You, lying under heavy eyelids, feel both truths tugging. Rest is precious, but so is wakefulness with clarity. You imagine the different classes encountering bromides. For the middle classes, powders came from chemists wrapped in crisp white paper packets, mixed into bedtime tonics with measured precision. For the working poor, they sometimes came secondhand, bought in smaller quantities, dissolved in whatever cup was available. A glass of water, a mug of beer, it didn't matter, so long as the night could be tamed. And of course, not everyone trusted them. Some reformers decried bromides as a chemical crutch, warning that reliance would weaken the will. Others embraced them wholeheartedly, even recommending them for restless children. You picture a Victorian nursery with bottles lined up beside rattles and storybooks, the line between medicine and magic growing perilously thin. As you trace the story, you notice how bromides represent a transition, away from folk remedies of lavender pillows and barley broth, toward a modern faith in laboratory chemistry. The powders are clean, clinical, measurable. They promise that sleeplessness is not a spiritual failing or a moral lapse, but a condition treatable with salts and science. Whether that promise delivers is another question, but the shift itself feels momentous. You try to imagine a sleepless night without any aids, no bromide, no opiate, no herbal sachet. Just you and the pillow waiting. The memory is uncomfortable. Sometimes the act of waiting is worse than the sleeplessness itself. So you stir a little of the white powder into water and sip. The bitterness clings to your tongue. Within half an hour your limbs seem to sink deeper into the mattress. Your thoughts slow, not erased but muffled, as though wrapped in wool. Still, the cost lingers. Your dreams feel gray, your morning heavy. You wonder whether a lifetime of this fog would be better or worse than years of insomnia. The question has no neat answer. For some, bromides were liberation. For others, a quiet prison. Perhaps both at once. Historians still argue whether bromide's dominance was a stepping stone to better pharmacology or a detour that trapped patients in sedation. From your vantage in the rose-patterned bedroom, you suspect it was both. A generation learned to treat sleeplessness as a condition worthy of chemistry, even if the cure dulled as much as it healed. The tin rests on the mantel, gleaming faintly in the lamplight. You set your empty glass beside it, stomach heavy with bitterness, mind softer than usual. Tomorrow you may feel the fog, but tonight you slide towards sleep, half grateful, half wary, knowing you are part of the long human experiment to master the mysteries of the night. You wake sluggish, as though the room itself has been stuffed with damp wool. The bromide fog still lingers in your head, clinging to your tongue with a metallic aftertaste. Even the act of drawing back the curtains feels like dragging chains. Yet on the bedside table, someone has left another curiosity. This time a bottle labeled paraldehyde, corked tightly and faintly reeking even through the glass. Welcome to the next chapter of Victorian chemical sleep. One mainstream fact: paraldehyde, discovered in the 1820s and popularized for medical use by the 1880s, became a staple sedative in asylums and hospitals. Doctors praised it as effective for calming agitation, seizures, and sleeplessness. Unlike opium, it was less addictive. Unlike bromides, it worked quickly and decisively. By the late 19th century, entire wards were said to exude its distinctive odor, sharp, sickly, like vinegar mingled with burnt rubber. Patients, doctors, even visiting relatives would have known instantly when paraldehyde had been administered. The first sip is a shock. You gag as if you've swallowed a concoction of paint thinner and overripe fruit. Victorians described it as unspeakably vile. Yet many endured it for the promise of dreamless rest. You feel it in your chest, then in your limbs, an unsettling warmth that soon dulls into heaviness. The bed seems to tilt forward, pushing you down into its folds. Quirky advice came with paraldehyde too. Some claimed mixing it with peppermint or strong coffee masked the flavor. Others believed taking it in a spoonful of jam would trap its fumes and spare the nose. A few eccentric physicians insisted that sniffing lavender before swallowing reduced its miasmatic aura. You try to imagine layering sweetness, coffee, and lavender atop that acrid brew, like decorating a toadstool with icing. Historians still argue whether paraldehyde represented progress or desperation. Some point to its clear utility in managing epileptic fits and calming psychiatric wards. Others lament how it became a blunt instrument, leaving entire institutions steeped in its sour smell, patients subdued less by care than by chemistry. You can almost picture the long dormitories, dozens of iron bedsteads, and the sharp tang that hung over everything like a chemical fog. Compared to bromides, paraldehyde was fast. Within minutes, eyelids drooped, agitation ebbed. That speed made it appealing to overworked doctors and nurses tasked with keeping order among hundreds of restless patients. For the middle-class insomniac at home, though, it was a more ambivalent choice, effective but distasteful, a remedy that worked at the cost of dignity and palate alike. You wonder how many took it reluctantly, weighing foulness against the fear of another sleepless night. The taste itself became a kind of test. To swallow paraldehyde was to prove you truly wanted oblivion, badly enough to endure the worst flavors alchemy could offer. The stuff separated the mildly restless from the truly desperate. Stranger still are the superstitions that sprouted around it. Some pamphlets warned that paraldehyde captures the soul's vapors, making one vulnerable to bad dreams if taken without a prayer. Others claimed the smell lingered in clothing, marking the insomniac like a scarlet letter. You imagine neighbors wrinkling their noses, whispering that Mrs. So-and-so's parlor always reeked faintly of hospital, as though insomnia itself were contagious. And yet, the relief could be undeniable. When you finally drift into sleep, it is deep and heavy, untroubled by the fragmented dreams that cheese or ale might provoke. Hours later, you wake with a pounding head and a sour breath that refuses to leave. The bedclothes seem to have absorbed the odor, and you wonder whether the cure is worse than the illness. Modern echoes surface here. Paraldehyde was one of the first truly hypnotic drugs, a chemical designed not just to calm, but to induce sleep directly. In that sense, it foreshadowed barbiturates and benzodiazepines, the lineage of modern sleeping pills. But unlike today's sleek tablets, it came with a brutal honesty. There was no disguising its foulness, no glamour in its use. To take it was to enter an uneasy pact with chemistry. Historians still argue whether patients accepted paraldehyde gratefully or resentfully. Some memoirs recall it as salvation. At last, silence. Others describe it as humiliation. I smelled like death, and everyone knew it. The truth likely lies in between, shaded by circumstance. If you were a patient in an overcrowded ward, the choice hardly felt like yours. If you were a sleepless clerk at home, the bitter draught may have been your last resort. You place the bottle back on the table, cork jammed tight. The odor lingers in the air like a warning, reminding you that every remedy has its price. Tonight you will sleep, yes, but at the cost of bitterness that clings to tongue, breath, and reputation. You exhale slowly, sinking into the mattress, knowing that in the Victorian quest for sleep, nothing comes without compromise. The sour stench of paraldehyde fades, but your clothes and pillow still hold its ghost. You decide to air the room, opening the sash so a draft of damp London air rolls in. And as you do, another figure enters your imagination, the asylum attendant. For in the Victorian world, sleeplessness wasn't only a private nuisance. In asylums, it became an institutional crisis, something to be managed, suppressed, and catalogued. One mainstream fact: Victorian asylums, booming in number during the 19th century, often housed hundreds or even thousands of patients, many of whom suffered from insomnia linked to mania, melancholy, or nervous disorders. Doctors noted repeatedly that sleeplessness was both symptom and cause. It worsened agitation, and agitation worsened sleeplessness. Entire treatment regimens were built around coaxing rest from troubled minds. You picture the dormitories, rows of narrow iron bedsteads, coarse blankets, gas lamps turned low but never extinguished. The hum of moaning, muttering, sometimes shrieking. Nurses pacing. Sleep was a communal ordeal, not a solitary one. If one patient roused, the ward often roused with them. You feel the claustrophobia, the night never truly private, the darkness never entirely yours. Quirky methods abounded. Some attendants believed rocking chairs helped, so patients were swayed gently for hours until their eyes drooped. Others swore by quiet cards, where restless inmates were encouraged to sort paper shapes until their nerves fatigued. One asylum in Yorkshire even experimented with warm porridge served at midnight, believing the heavy starch worked like a sedative. You imagine the clatter of bowls in the dark hall, spoons clicking while patients huddled around for their strange nocturnal feast. But of course, the harsher methods dominated. Restraint chairs, padded rooms, cold water treatments, all justified by the idea that calming the body might calm the brain. Laudanum and paraldehyde became staples, their smells and effects saturating wards until whole institutions seemed perfumed with despair. Historians still argue whether asylum doctors genuinely sought to soothe patients' nights, or whether they were primarily managing chaos, keeping order for staff rather than healing for inmates. The line is thin. One memoir from a nurse describes tiptoeing past beds whispering prayers that patients would stay asleep, not for their sake, but so the ward would remain quiet enough for attendants to rest. You think about class again. The sleepless middle-class gentleman at home had the luxury of broth, pamphlets, bromides. The pauper in the asylum had only what the institution offered: sedatives, discipline, routine. Sleep became a tool of control. A sleeping patient was manageable, a waking one dangerous. Insomnia was pathologized, punished, or drugged into silence. And yet, not all accounts are grim. Some reform-minded superintendents tried to create gentler nighttime environments. Softer blankets, firelight instead of gas, quiet walks in garden courtyards before bed. There are letters describing patients calmed by evening hymns sung softly in groups, the harmonies lulling even the agitated into a kind of peace. You imagine yourself there, listening in the half-dark, voices weaving a human sedative more potent than any vial. The debate over night in the asylum reflects a broader truth. Victorian society was terrified of sleeplessness not just as a personal nuisance, but as a social disruption. In households, it frayed domestic harmony. In asylums, it threatened order. Night without rest seemed dangerous, as if society itself might unravel in the long hours before dawn. Stranger still are the superstitions asylum staff reported. Some believed the insane were more vulnerable to moonlight, so windows were shuttered to block lunar beams. Others claimed restless inmates were possessed by night spirits, and a few attendants carried talismans or crucifixes in their pockets when patrolling wards. These beliefs sat uneasily alongside modern chemical cures, a reminder that even institutions touted as scientific still swam in folklore. You imagine yourself as a patient there, eyes open at 2 in the morning, hearing groans and footsteps, smelling the acrid sting of formaldehyde in the air. Sleep becomes less about peace and more about surrender. Do you yield to the draft offered? Do you endure the long night awake? Neither feels entirely like choice. Historians still argue whether asylum insomnia treatments were primitive cruelty or sincere but clumsy compassion. From where you lie, you sense both. The rocking chair and the midnight porridge sound almost tender, the straitjacket and cold bath brutal. The line between cure and control blurs until they are indistinguishable. Tonight, back in your own narrow bed, you feel a haunting sympathy for those Victorian patients whose sleeplessness was never private. At least in your room, when you toss and turn, it is your own restlessness alone. In those dormitories, the insomnia of one rippled outward, disturbing dozens. Sleep was communal, fragile, and contested. You close your eyes and imagine a chorus of whispered hymns soothing a ward into uneasy rest, and the thought carries you, just barely, toward your own. The echo of asylum hymns fades, and now you find yourself wandering through a quieter chamber, a physician's consulting room, its shelves lined with neat rows of glass jars and brass instruments. Tonight, the cure offered isn't chemical or institutional but mechanical. Victorians adored devices, and if sleep refused to arrive naturally, perhaps it could be engineered. One mainstream fact: by the late 19th century, inventors produced dozens of contraptions aimed at calming nerves and inducing sleep. Weighted blankets, vibrating chairs, even devices that pulsed small electrical currents across the scalp. The age of industrial innovation spilled into the bedroom, promising that insomnia could be solved with gears, levers, and a dash of electricity. On the table before you lies a sleep helmet, a strange cage of wires and pads meant to apply gentle pressure around the head. Advertisements claimed it harmonized the brain circulation, redistributing blood so thought would settle into dream. You place it over your temples, feel the odd weight, and wonder whether the true effect is physiological or just the placebo of strapping something serious-looking to your skull. The quirky end of these devices veers into comedy. One 1870s patent describes a cradle-like bed that slowly rocked adults through the night, powered by clockwork gears. Another offers a somnambulant harness to prevent tossing and turning, keeping the sleeper rigidly still, as if trussed like a parcel. You can almost hear the creak of springs and the whir of gears in some poor insomniac's bedroom, a lullaby of machinery. Historians still argue whether these inventions genuinely relieved patients or were mostly products of entrepreneurial opportunism. Some suggest that the very ritual of strapping into a gadget gave sufferers a sense of agency, which in turn lowered anxiety. Others dismiss them as expensive nonsense that preyed on desperation. You, slipping the helmet aside, feel both interpretations tugging. Desperation makes even absurdity seem plausible at 2 in the morning. Electricity fascinated Victorians most of all. Doctors experimented with mild shocks to the spine or temples, claiming the pulses could reset nervous patterns. Clinics offered galvanic baths, where patients sat in water infused with electric current, a prickling sensation meant to calm hysteria and promote sleep. You shiver at the thought. A bathtub hums with invisible power while an attendant adjusts copper wires on the rim. Comforting? Perhaps. Terrifying? Absolutely. And then there were weighted devices, blankets stitched with shot or sand, belts lined with iron plates. These were said to ground the body, pressing it into stillness. The logic was simple. Pressure would reduce restless twitching. Modern echoes abound. Today's weighted blankets borrow the same principle, minus the iron smell of Victorian industry. You tuck an imaginary sand-filled coverlet around yourself and notice the peculiar reassurance of weight, how it pins your anxieties a little flatter. Yet many contraptions also carried an aura of discipline, restraint disguised as therapy. A harness that prevents tossing looks less like comfort and more like control, an echo of the asylum's padded rooms. You wonder if the line between voluntary gadget and enforced restraint was as thin as the straps themselves. There is humor too. Satirical magazines mocked the proliferation of sleep machines, printing cartoons of insomniacs wired like telegraphs, beds mounted on pendulums, or patients plugged into giant brass coils that sparked over their heads. The public laughed, but not too loudly, because many secretly longed for such contraptions to work. Historians still argue whether the rise of these devices represented real progress towards sleep science or a detour into quackery. Some point to precursors of modern therapies, pressure, rhythmic movement, even gentle current, that remain in use today. Others see them as symbols of an era intoxicated by machinery, determined to mechanize even the private mystery of slumber. As you lie back, you picture yourself in one of those rocking beds, swaying gently with the tick of hidden gears. Would it soothe you like a cradle, or simply remind you that you've become an overgrown infant strapped to a contraption? The answer may not matter. In the half-dark, with the steady rhythm beneath you, you feel your breathing sink to the sway. Mockery aside, the body sometimes cares less about theory than sensation. The consulting room grows quiet. The helmet, the belts, the wires sit in stillness, waiting for the next restless patient to surrender to their mechanical promises. You close your eyes and drift, half amused, half comforted, imagining yourself rocked toward sleep by the absurd but earnest machinery of a century that refused to accept that night should remain untamed. The gears and straps fade, and now you walk through a doorway into a room that smells of varnished wood, chalk dust, and old leather bindings. Here, the treatment for insomnia isn't smoke, nor syrup, nor sparks, it's movement. The Victorians, so fond of regimens and rules, believed that a restless body could be drilled into sleep the way a soldier is drilled into obedience. The mainstream fact: many 19th century physicians recommended systematic physical exercise for the sleepless, especially gentle gymnastics before bed. Manuals instructed patients to stretch their arms like wings, bend forward, twist the torso, and march in place, all intended to expend surplus nervous energy. Some medical schools even published illustrated guides showing insomniacs how to limber their joints before tucking in. You try a slow forward bend, vertebrae cracking, and wonder if the Victorians were onto something. But the fringe cures go much further. One eccentric lecturer argued that spinning in circles until dizzy would disorient the mind into repose. Another advocated bouncing lightly on a sprung board, claiming the rhythm lulled the brain like waves. You picture yourself whirling about in a gaslit parlor, collapsing onto a sofa, your head reeling, and perhaps, yes, slipping into unconsciousness, though hardly the peaceful sort. Historians still argue whether these regimens reflect genuine proto-exercise science, or were mostly moral crusades disguised as therapy. Exercise was tangled up with Victorian fears of idleness. A sleepless person was accused of harboring too much energy, even sinful restlessness. So doctors prescribed regimented calisthenics not only to quiet nerves, but to enforce a disciplined body. Sleep became another frontier for self-improvement. The gymnasium itself was a curious Victorian invention. Ropes dangling from beams, wooden rings, Indian clubs polished smooth from sweaty hands. Some sufferers were told to swing the clubs until their arms burned, exhausting themselves into bed. Others climbed ladders, did slow squats, or held poses meant to balance the vital currents. Imagine yourself in wool pajamas, barefoot on wooden floors, trying not to smash a lamp while flinging a weighted club in circles. And then there was walking, always walking. Doctors recommended evening strolls down quiet lanes, or laps through drawing rooms when weather was foul. The rhythm of footsteps was believed to lull the nervous system, just as rocking calmed a baby. Yet some took it further, urging insomniacs to walk until collapse, reasoning that exhaustion guaranteed oblivion. You picture late-night streets dotted with shadows of insomniacs trudging endlessly, their steps echoing like a nocturnal orchestra. The quirky detail. A few manuals suggested combining exercise with chanting, reciting psalms, multiplication tables, or patriotic verses while moving the limbs. The words kept the mind from straying into anxiety, they claimed, while the body drained itself of tension. It's half workout, half mantra, and wholly odd. You whisper numbers under your breath as you swing your arms, and against expectation, the rhythm does calm you a little. Of course, risks abounded. Physicians warned that excessive exertion could overstimulate the system, leaving patients more awake than before. Gentle stretches might soothe, but club-swinging marathons at midnight often led to pounding hearts and sweaty sheets. Balance was elusive, and patients often overshot the mark, chasing sleep only to find themselves flushed with adrenaline. Historians still argue whether these routines contributed to modern physiotherapy or were merely cultural expressions of Victorian discipline. Some see echoes in yoga and Tai Chi, slow, rhythmic movements paired with breath. Others dismiss them as puritanical exercise fads dressed up as medical advice. The truth may be that both interpretations are correct, depending on who was pacing the hall at 2 in the morning. You pause to catch your breath, imagining the quiet of a Victorian household where someone down the corridor is doing the same, bending, stretching, counting softly, hoping the repetition will carry them toward oblivion. The floorboards creak in unison, as though insomnia has choreographed its own midnight dance. And for a moment, you feel less alone, part of a long parade of restless bodies, trying through motion what stillness would not give. The hush of rhythmic footsteps fades, and now you slip into a drawing room dressed in pale wallpaper and polished brass. A single green bottle catches the lamplight on a side table, its contents glowing faintly like liquid fire. You recognize the label from whispered warnings and sensational headlines. Chloral hydrate, the so-called knockout drops of the Victorian era. Here, insomnia has moved from herbs and rituals into the realm of chemistry, potent and dangerously efficient. The mainstream fact: chloral hydrate was introduced in the 1860s and rapidly became the first widely used prescription sleeping draught. Doctors hailed it as a miracle, praising its ability to induce deep sleep without the delirium of opium. By the 1870s, it was a staple of apothecaries, recommended not just for insomnia but for convulsions, hysteria, and even childhood restlessness. A teaspoon stirred into water, and the patient was promised oblivion within half an hour. You lift the imagined glass, smell nothing at all. Chloral is nearly tasteless, which made it infamous. A few sips, and the world slides away. But already you sense the darker undertones, the edges of dependency lurking. For many, the first miracle dose was followed by the second, then the third, until the cure became the very cause of suffering. The quirky detail: chloral hydrate acquired a shadow life outside the doctor's office. Mixed into drinks at bars, it became a tool of crime, slipping victims into stupefied slumber. Newspapers loved the scandal, dubbing it the Mickey Finn. And in the parlor, bored society ladies stirred it discreetly into their tea, turning polite gatherings into hazy reveries. You can almost hear the clink of porcelain, the faint sigh of someone sinking too quickly into dreams. Historians still argue whether chloral hydrate represented progress in sleep medicine or simply shifted the risks of opium into another form. Some emphasize its role as a stepping stone toward modern sedatives, a genuine medical advance. Others highlight its addictive spiral, noting how many patients found themselves unable to sleep without it, their tolerance climbing until the doses grew dangerous. The bottle on the table beckons with its promise of reliable unconsciousness. Compared to fumigations and rocking beds, this is brutally efficient. Drink and you're gone. Yet there's something unnerving in that speed, as if you've handed the keys of your mind to a stranger. Victorian doctors, too, were torn. Some swore by its gentleness. Others warned that long-term use hollowed patients into shells. You recall anecdotes of artists and writers relying on chloral. A famous poet confessed that he could no longer dream unaided, his nights a blur of drugged blankness. Another diarist described the peculiar half-state it produced. Not quite natural sleep, not quite waking, but a limbo that left him more exhausted by morning. The cure, in other words, often cheated. Imagine yourself measuring out a Victorian teaspoon, larger than today's, and watching the crystals dissolve. You drink, wait, and feel the slow melting of thought. It seems at first like mercy, a surrender of the relentless mind. But as your body slumps, a question lingers. Are you sleeping, or are you merely stunned into silence? The allure of chloral was not just its effect, but its accessibility. Unlike opium dens or asylum treatments, this came in a neat bottle from the chemist, respectable and convenient. Middle-class households kept it tucked in medicine cabinets beside cough syrup. It democratized sedation, and in doing so, spread dependency more widely than ever before. Historians still argue whether Victorians truly misunderstood its risks or chose to overlook them. Advertisements downplayed addiction, portraying chloral as clean science compared to smoky opium. Yet letters and diaries reveal patients whispering confessions. They feared the night without it, dreaded the creeping wakefulness that returned the moment they tried to stop. You place the bottle back on the table, resisting its siren call. Around you, the drawing room feels heavier, as though the air remembers all those who once surrendered to that green glass glow. And you realize that while Victorian insomnia was often treated with smoke, machines, or ritual, it was here, in the quiet authority of chemistry, that the most dangerous bargain was struck. A sleep purchased, but at a cost that could last far longer than a single night. The green bottle fades into the shadows, and you wander onward into a quieter chamber. Here the light is softer, filtered through paper lanterns, and the smell is not of chemicals or resins, but of delicate blossoms. This is the Victorian world of herbal teas and floral remedies, where sleeplessness is coaxed away with cups of steaming infusions rather than stunned with laboratory powders. The mainstream fact, chamomile, lavender, valerian, and hops were staples in 19th century home medicine for insomnia. Physicians and domestic guides alike recommended brewing gentle teas an hour before bed, letting the steam calm nerves and the warmth settle the stomach. A teacup, finely painted and warmed in your hands, became as much a ritual of comfort as a prescription. You lift one now, inhale the apple-sweet scent of chamomile. The sip is light, almost too delicate, yet soothing. You imagine a weary clerk or governess performing the same small ceremony, finding a shred of peace in the simple act of drinking. The quirky detail: some Victorians believed that hops, the same bitter flowers used in brewing beer, worked best when stuffed into a pillow. Guides suggested stitching a small sachet of dried hops inside the case, so the sleeper inhaled their aroma all night. Of course, the result was a bed smelling faintly of ale, and complaints that one woke craving a pint more than a nap. Still, households swore by their hop pillows, convinced that the fragrance alone could carry them into slumber. Historians still argue whether these herbal remedies provided genuine sedative effects or simply worked as rituals of expectation. Modern science does find mild calming compounds in chamomile and valerian, yet skeptics point out that doses brewed in Victorian teacups were far too small to be pharmacologically strong. Perhaps, then, the medicine was not in the plant but in the pause, the hot water, the gentle scent, the permission to rest. Other floral experiments abounded. Orange blossom water, rose tea, and elderflower infusions were all recommended at various times. You imagine sipping from ornate porcelain, the liquid tinted pale green or pink, its taste somewhere between perfume and potion. In an age obsessed with industrial progress, the floral cure carried the aura of something ancient, almost pastoral, a reminder that nature still offered its own quieting hand. One eccentric pamphlet urged patients to boil lettuce and drink the cooled broth. Another recommended soaking carnations in milk, then straining and sipping the floral cream. You raise an eyebrow, but perhaps desperation turns even lettuce water into a kind of elixir. Historians still argue whether the popularity of these teas reflected genuine efficacy or simply a cultural longing for gentleness amid an era of harsh tonics and strong spirits. Many Victorians distrusted opium and chloral, preferring remedies that seemed safe enough for children and grandparents alike. The herbal cup was democratic, shared across classes and households, needing no doctor's prescription, only a kettle and a handful of dried petals. You cradle the imaginary teacup a little longer, letting the warmth seep into your palms. The steam fogs your face, carrying with it the faint promise of calm. And as you breathe, you realize that even if the drink itself does little, the ritual shapes your night. The act of slowing, of sipping, of breathing fragrant air, this too is medicine, woven from pause and patience rather than chemistry. The cup empties, the room grows quiet, and you lean back into the soft perfume of lavender drifting on the air. For once, the cure feels less like a battle against sleeplessness and more like an invitation to rest. The fragrance of lavender lingers, but as you move on, the atmosphere sharpens. Shelves appear, stacked high with glossy magazines, penny pamphlets, and hardcover tomes bound in cloth. This is not a laboratory or a parlor. It's the bustling print world of Victorian Britain, where sleeplessness was not only a private struggle, but also a booming industry. If you couldn't sleep, someone was ready to sell you a story about why. The mainstream fact: insomnia manuals flourished in the 19th century. Doctors published guides detailing nervous exhaustion, sleeplessness, and modern fatigue, while publishers rushed to release household almanacs full of bedtime tips. Periodicals serialized articles warning that sleeplessness was both a symptom and a danger, signaling nervous collapse, even madness if left untreated. You pick up a volume and feel the weight of its seriousness, the pages thick with prescriptions and diagrams. Yet alongside the serious texts came the quirky flood of advice pamphlets. Some promised miracle cures in 10 easy steps. Bathe your feet in mustard water and never worry again. Others swore that if you counted backward from 1,000 while staring at your toes, unconsciousness was guaranteed. These pamphlets sold for pennies at railway stalls, and their optimism was as cheap as their paper. Historians still argue whether the explosion of print on sleeplessness reflected a genuine epidemic or a cultural fascination stoked by publishers. Was insomnia truly more common, or merely more talked about? The debate remains unresolved, though the stacks of publications suggest that sleeplessness had become a commercial topic, ripe for consumption. Advertising blurred the line between medicine and marketing. Glossy spreads promoted patent remedies, chloral mixtures, hop tonics, sleep elixirs, often illustrated with engravings of angelic sleepers cradled in clouds. The text promised transformation, from restless torment to the sweetest repose. In tiny print, disclaimers reminded readers to consult their physicians. You can almost hear the rustle of newspapers as exhausted readers scanned for hope in ink and woodcut. The quirky detail: some periodicals published entire bedtime reading columns designed as cures in themselves. Short, dull essays on farming or trade statistics were intended to bore the reader into slumber. One even published blank pages under the title, "A Guaranteed Sleep Aid," instructing the reader to stare until their eyes closed. You smile at the audacity, charging readers for the privilege of staring at nothing. Publishers also targeted women specifically. Advice books warned that sleepless mothers endangered not just themselves but their children, urging them to adopt stricter routines or purchase calming tonics. Men, meanwhile, were told their insomnia reflected overwork, the burden of industry and empire. In both cases, sleeplessness was framed as a moral failing as much as a medical problem. Historians still argue whether this literature helped sufferers feel less alone or simply heightened their anxiety by insisting that insomnia carried dire consequences. Imagine yourself reading by candlelight, every paragraph confirming that your sleeplessness meant weakness, fragility, even doom. Would that comfort you, or deepen the pit in your stomach? And yet, buried among the panic and the quackery, some advice resonates even now. Establish routine, keep the bedroom cool, avoid late heavy meals. You realize that while Victorian print sometimes oversold or moralized, it also seeded practices that echo in modern sleep hygiene guides. The difference lies mostly in tone. Today's advice is clinical, there's melodramatic. You replace the pamphlet on its shelf, feeling the faintly oily paper under your fingers. Around you, the room seems to buzz with voices, the anxious cadence of advertisements, the stern lectures of physicians, the desperate mutter of readers turning pages at midnight. Print offered comfort, instruction, and exploitation all at once, wrapping sleeplessness in ink and commerce. And as you leave, you notice a last stack of pamphlets by the door, their covers promising cures for just a penny. You think of all the hands that once reached for them in railway stations, clutching flimsy hope on their way home to another long night. You move on, stepping into a space dimly lit by flickering gas lamps, the walls lined with the faint aroma of dried herbs and incense. This is the domestic bedroom again, the private theater of Victorian sleeplessness. Here, the remedies are intimate, sensory, and sometimes downright whimsical, designed not to stun or discipline, but to cradle the mind and body into rest. The mainstream fact: lavender, chamomile, and valerian weren't just brewed in teacups. They were tucked into pillows, sprinkled into warm baths, and steeped in bedtime sachets. The Victorians believed scent worked on the nerves, guiding thoughts away from daily worries toward gentle relaxation. You place your hand over a lavender sachet, inhaling the faint, sweet aroma, and feel a small shift, a loosening of tension that no chemical could replicate. But the whimsical side surfaces quickly. Some recommended placing a silver coin under the pillow to attract pleasant dreams, or sprinkling rosewater on the sheets to soothe the spirits. Others advised tying sprigs of rue to the headboard to ward off nightmare-inducing vapors. You chuckle, picturing the brass bed framed in flowers and silver, a soldiered defense against insomnia's imagined demons. Historians still argue whether such ritualized remedies had physiological effects or merely psychological reassurance. Many suggest the success of scented pillows and warm baths relied on the placebo power of routine and expectation. Yet the tactile and olfactory engagement seems to have provided a genuine sense of calm. You feel it yourself, the familiar weight of a pillow scented with lavender, the warmth of a blanket, the steady rhythm of slow breathing. Another quirky detail: Victorian children were sometimes treated with dream bottles, small flasks filled with water, petals, or crushed herbs. The child would shake the bottle and focus on its contents while reciting a rhyme, supposedly lulling the mind into dream state. You can almost hear the soft chanting, a domestic lullaby that mixes sensory delight with structured ritual. And for adults, bedtime literature played a similar role. Gentle novels, moral tales, or dull essays were recommended as soporific companions, their words guiding the mind away from anxiety and into a drowsy rhythm. Unlike sensationalist pamphlets, these texts sought to comfort rather than alarm. You imagine turning pages in a dimly lit room, the soft rustle acting as a metronome for sleep. Historians still argue whether the Victorians truly believed in the magical qualities of scent and ritual, or whether they simply valued the calming effect of ceremony itself. Perhaps the line doesn't matter. The combination of smell, touch, and quiet expectation often did what chemicals and machinery could not. Sleep, after all, sometimes requires patience more than power. Some Victorian guides suggested ambient sounds, wind chimes, trickling water, or the faint hum of a distant clock, as subtle hypnotics. Others recommended small gestures, aligning shoes neatly, folding garments, laying out the next day's schedule. These actions, while ostensibly mundane, provided the nervous system with structure, a signal that the day was complete and rest could be allowed. You replicate these small rituals, noticing how repetition, familiarity, and tactile engagement seem to ease your tension. And still, Victorian domestic insomnia treatment embraced gentle irony. That to fight sleeplessness, you often did the simplest, quietest things. No drugs, no shocks, no rocking beds, just warmth, scent, routine, and a carefully modulated environment. The night itself became a co-conspirator, shaped by gentle attention rather than coerced by chemicals or devices. As you sink into your imagined bed, smelling lavender and hearing the faint tick of a clock, you understand why these domestic rituals persisted even as chemical sedatives proliferated. They offered control without coercion, comfort without sedation, a human-scale intervention for a fundamentally human problem. And in that knowledge, you feel your eyes grow heavier, the mind softening, the body ready at last to surrender to night. The domestic bedroom dissolves, and you drift into a strange twilight space, a library of memories and stories whispered between generations. Here, insomnia is treated not by chemicals, machines, or herbs, but by narrative itself. Victorian writers, keenly aware of sleepless nights, produced entire genres aimed at calming the restless mind. You find yourself drawn to these tales, the printed word as a gentle guide through the dark. One mainstream fact: bedtime stories, moral tales, and pastoral essays were considered legitimate tools for promoting sleep. Authors like Mrs. Beeton and other household guides included long, descriptive passages meant to lull readers into calm. Gentle plots, pastoral settings, and predictable outcomes were deliberately chosen to prevent excitement or agitation. You run your fingers over the spines of these books, imagining readers in candlelit rooms, pages rustling softly as eyelids grow heavy. The quirky detail: some authors recommended that the stories themselves be read aloud, not too quickly and with soft, rhythmic inflection, essentially an early form of guided sleep narration. Certain moral tales were deliberately dull by design, featuring detailed descriptions of furniture, domestic chores, or the life cycle of farm animals. You smile, picturing a Victorian mother narrating the intricate tasks of a goose herder to a half-awake child, each monotone sentence a gentle push towards slumber. Historians still argue whether these literary interventions were truly effective or largely symbolic. Some studies suggest that focused attention on neutral narratives may have allowed the brain to disengage from anxiety, providing cognitive quiet. Others emphasize that Victorian sleep literature reflects a broader cultural obsession with moral regulation, turning bedtime into a structured ritual of virtue as well as rest. Victorian adults were not exempt. Gentle essays on landscape painting, natural history, or local botany were recommended for exhausted clerks and governesses, their dry content deliberately avoiding emotional stimulation. You pick up a volume describing the nuances of leaf shapes, imagining the soothing cadence of its passages, carrying your own thoughts slowly downward into the subconscious. Yet literary remedies could border on the absurd. Some manuals suggested writing one's own sleep diary, noting every detail of daily activity, including meals, movements, and emotional fluctuations. This act, ostensibly therapeutic, often became a tiresome ritual, with sleep arriving only after the mind was thoroughly fatigued by self-recording. You picture an exhausted writer scribbling furiously by lamplight, pen scratching, eyelids drooping, chasing sleep through meticulous observation. Historians still argue whether this emphasis on narrative represents a genuine cognitive approach to insomnia or merely an extension of Victorian moral discipline. Regardless, the intersection of literature and sleep demonstrates a uniquely human approach, using story, rhythm, and imagination as a remedy. The mind itself becomes the instrument and the patient, lulled gently into repose. Some guides even recommended reading aloud to the air itself, as if the voice could carry tension away. You try it softly, feeling the syllables loosen the tight coil of your thoughts. It's intimate, voluntary, and profoundly human, a treatment shaped by patience, voice, and imagination rather than force. By the time you set the book down, the mind feels lighter. The narratives have done their quiet work. You sense that sleep might arrive without chemicals, contraptions, or forced motion, simply carried by the gentle cadence of human attention, story, and imagination. Tonight, it seems, the mind has found its own lullaby. The library dissolves into a soft, hazy corridor, and you walk now among whispers of night and shadowed memories. Here, insomnia is approached with a combination of social ritual and environmental design. Victorians believed that context, ambience, and propriety were as potent as any chemical or herbal remedy. The room feels staged, curtains drawn, windows slightly ajar, a faint aroma of dried herbs lingering in the air. One mainstream fact: Victorians were meticulous about the bedroom environment. They recommended cool, well-ventilated rooms, minimal clutter, and soft, natural light sources at night. Heavy drapes were drawn during the day to prevent sunlight from disturbing evening rest, while open windows allowed for circulation, combating stagnant air, which physicians claimed aggravated nerves. You run a hand along a smooth wooden mantel, noting how attention to small details, temperature, smell, sound, was thought to regulate the body's rhythms. Quirky advice abounds. Some guides instructed placing a sprig of rosemary or lavender near the pillow not only for scent, but as a protective charm against restless spirits. Others recommended sprinkling fine sand on the floor near the bed, believing its subtle crunching sound as one walked encouraged calm and ritualized readiness for sleep. You imagine pacing softly, the grains crunching underfoot, a nocturnal meditation that doubles as environmental therapy. Historians still argue whether these environmental prescriptions were genuinely medical or more an expression of Victorian aesthetic control. Bedrooms became theaters of discipline, light, sound, and scent coordinated to train the body into obedience. Yet there is undeniable wisdom in these measures, echoing in modern sleep hygiene, cool rooms, minimal light, consistent routines. Furniture arrangement was another dimension of treatment. Beds were positioned to face doors or windows in prescribed ways, sometimes aligning with household feng shui principles, though modified by Victorian sensibilities. The belief was that harmonious spatial design promoted calm nerves and mitigated sleeplessness. You trace the imagined layout of the room, noting how symmetry and order can themselves comfort a restless mind. Even social rituals played a role. Households often observed early evening routines. Soft music, muted conversation, and the gradual dimming of activity signaled the body that the day was ending. Meals were light and timed to prevent digestion from interfering with rest. You imagine yourself observing this choreography of night, each motion, each gesture a gentle coaxing of the nervous system toward sleep. Historians still argue whether these environmental strategies were primarily practical or symbolic, enforcing order while pacifying nerves. The line between science and ritual often blurred. Nevertheless, the holistic attention to environment, scent, ritual, and social cues highlights a Victorian understanding of insomnia that was remarkably nuanced, acknowledging the body, the mind, and the space they inhabit. Tonight, in your imagined chamber, you sense the layers of care: cool air, rhythmic movement, soft scent, muted sound coalescing. The room itself seems to breathe with you, each object, each corner conspiring to make rest possible. Sleep feels less like a conquest and more like a gentle yielding to the orchestration of light, scent, and rhythm, a final homage to the intricate human art of bedtime. The corridor fades into a dim, quiet street, and you feel the night stretching endlessly around you. Outside, gas lamps flicker, and the faint murmur of distant carriages blends with the rustle of leaves. Here, insomnia is confronted not with drugs, devices, or domestic rituals, but with the gentle passage of time itself. Victorians sometimes recommended surrendering to night, embracing the darkness as a companion rather than a foe. One mainstream fact: many Victorian guides advised patients to accept the inevitability of sleepless nights, suggesting reading, meditation, or gentle contemplation until drowsiness arrived naturally. The idea was that anxiety over being awake often worsened insomnia, so patient acceptance and calm reflection could be curative. You lean against a wrought iron railing, imagining yourself counting the gas lamps as a quiet focus for your wandering mind. Quirky practices persisted, too. Some advocated holding a pebble in one hand, tossing it lightly whenever thoughts wandered, as a tactile anchor for concentration. Others recommended speaking aloud to the shadows, reciting poetry or prayers softly until the voice itself lulled the nervous system. You trace imaginary pebbles in your palm, the rhythm grounding, oddly soothing. Historians still argue whether these psychological techniques prefigured modern cognitive therapies or were simply quaint eccentricities. Certainly, they recognized that insomnia was as much a state of mind as a physical condition, and that attention, focus, and ritual could mediate restfulness without any chemical intervention. The overlap with contemporary mindfulness techniques is striking, even if unintended. Victorians also emphasized the value of routine in the longer term. Consistent bedtimes, measured activity, and the steady marking of hours were thought to train the body's circadian rhythm. The simplest remedy, they believed, was consistency, allowing the body to anticipate rest and gradually drift into it. You notice how your own breathing begins to fall into a predictable rhythm, echoing the broader Victorian philosophy of aligning life with natural cycles. Yet, even here, humanity intrudes. Some patients wrote diaries of their sleeplessness, detailing every hour, every thought, every frustration. This introspection sometimes helped, sometimes exacerbated the problem. The act of chronicling made the mind a laboratory of its own restlessness. You imagine your own half-dream diary, pages filled with nocturnal wandering and whispered confessions. Historians still argue whether these personal exercises were genuinely therapeutic or mostly expressive. Likely both. The act of noting, reflecting, and observing one's own patterns gave a measure of control in an otherwise uncontrollable night. Victorian insomnia treatment, in its final evolution, recognized that the mind itself needed tending, like a garden, quiet and deliberate, to flourish in the dark hours. And as the distant clock tolls, you feel the culmination of the night's journey. Chemical sedatives, rocking beds, hypnotic devices, herbal infusions, literary lullabies, environmental orchestration, all converge into a single realization. Sleep, no matter the era or method, is an intricate dance between body, mind, and ritual. The Victorian struggle was exhausting, inventive, often dangerous, and endlessly human. And now, walking home through the soft glow of gaslight, you feel the weight of history settle gently, carrying your consciousness toward that long-sought rest. The night stretches softly around you now, a quiet expanse of shadow and faint lamplight. The air feels cool against your skin, carrying a whisper of lavender, chamomile, and distant memories of other centuries. You exhale slowly, releasing the tension of thought and imagining your body sinking into a gentle mattress, each limb folding with ease, each breath expanding and softening. The long journey through Victorian insomnia, a parade of remedies, rituals, machines, and potions, feels behind you, a tapestry woven from curiosity, anxiety, and care. You picture the faint flicker of candlelight against a brass bedpost, the soft sigh of linen sliding beneath your shoulder, the distant hum of a world moving on while you remain tucked in stillness. Time itself seems to slow, the hours dissolving into one continuous, comforting present. Your mind drifts, recalling the rocking beds, the hop-scented pillows, the lull of narrative and story, the tiny rituals of pebble tossing or diary writing. Each element folds neatly into your memory, as if night itself has drawn a curtain between you and wakefulness. Even your thoughts, once insistent and racing, now curl around gentle images. Soft steam rising from a teacup, the measured tick of a clock, the hum of a fan carrying warm air in soft circles. You feel weight and warmth, calm and safety, as the body remembers what the Victorians always knew: that sleep is a gift, earned not through force, but through patient surrender. Let your eyelids drift heavier with every blink, your thoughts unwinding like ribbons. The stories, scents, rhythms, and rituals of the night fold into a quiet echo that lulls your mind. In this softness, you are cradled not just by mattress and pillow, but by centuries of human attempts to find peace when darkness seems endless. And now, as the last vestiges of consciousness float away, you are ready. Sleep arrives gently, carrying with it the calm of centuries, the quietude of careful ritual, and the promise of morning light yet to come.